Two highly significant events have just collided on the geopolitical chessboard. Donald Trump has officially declared an extension to the current ceasefire, while J.D. Vance has notably kept his plane grounded, indefinitely pausing his diplomatic mission to Pakistan. When you look at these two seemingly isolated data points together, a much deeper reality emerges, one that cuts closer to the absolute truth of this conflict than any flashing news headline. Let US strip away the diplomatic noise and look at the raw facts. Trump issued a statement outlining that the United States military has been ordered to maintain its current blockade and overall readiness, meaning this ceasefire extension is strictly conditional. It will only hold until a new proposal is formally submitted and discussions reach some form of conclusion. This is not a standard, mutually agreed upon formal extension. Rather, it is an open-ended, unilateral signal. Simultaneously, Vance has remained in Washington, holding high-level strategic meetings at the White House, with key figures like Wickoff and Kushner to chart the next strategic moves. His anticipated trip to Islamabad is frozen in a state of indefinite suspension. Meanwhile, Pakistani officials, including Foreign Minister Dar and Prime Minister Sharif, are engaging in intense, behind-the-scenes mediation with Tehran. Interestingly, massive billboards promoting the Islamabad peace talks are still standing outside the Serena Hotel, indicating that regional players still heavily bet on these negotiations eventually resuming. Yet, what does this precise combination of a conditional pause and a grounded diplomatic team actually tell us? In the traditional theater of international relations, when a ceasefire is extended, it typically signals that both factions see tangible progress and mutually require more time. However, when the pause is extended, but the negotiating team refuses to depart, the dynamic fundamentally shifts. This is Washington sending a stark, unilateral message to Tehran. Time is available, but the burden of action lies entirely in your hands. Indeed, the American negotiation strategy has pivoted sharply. The political optics of a sitting vice president waiting idly in a foreign capital for an adversarial delegation to arrive are simply too damaging. Therefore, Washington is demanding a public, undeniable commitment from Iran before any American official boards a flight. Historically, this type of diplomatic waiting game, where both major powers sit paralyzed, waiting for the other to blink first, is one of the most common ways that fragile peace talks collapse entirely. Forcing an adversary to make the first public concession is a high-risk strategy that tests the limits of political pride. Nevertheless, in this specific theater, a profound asymmetry exists. Time is not a neutral arbiter here. The daily financial hemorrhage caused by the ongoing maritime blockade is systematically punishing the Iranian economy, while the United States remains largely insulated from the immediate shockwaves. It is a brutal game of chicken, and the ultimate cost of blinking is exponentially higher for Tehran. To truly understand this geopolitical maneuvering, one must look deep into the internal contradictions tearing at the fabric of Tehran's decision-making apparatus. Currently, the Iranian leadership is trapped between two mutually exclusive necessities. The first is an absolute existential requirement to negotiate. The comprehensive energy blockade, compounded by pre-existing international sanctions and severe wartime infrastructural damage, is systematically asphyxiating their domestic economy. During the course of this conflict, the Iranian gross domestic product has experienced a brutal contraction, with maritime energy exports heavily restricted. The state is bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars in vital revenue every single day. For the average citizen, this translates into skyrocketing living costs, extreme currency devaluation, and acute shortages of essential materials. These compounding domestic crises are relentlessly pushing the political elite toward the negotiating table. Yet, the second necessity is equally paralyzing: the imperative to avoid any appearance of capitulation. The national psyche is deeply scarred. Following the targeted assassination of their supreme leader and catastrophic military losses, the newly installed government, having assumed power during a period of extreme trauma, cannot afford to project weakness. If the administration appears to be buckling under the sheer weight of American pressure, the domestic political blowback could be fatal. They are compelled to prove to their populace that they are extracting the best possible terms, not raising a white flag. This creates a fascinating duality in their current diplomatic posture. Practically, they are making meticulous preparations for talks. Outwardly, they are projecting an aura of unyielding defiance. This explains why Iranian state television definitively announced that no diplomatic delegation was traveling to Islamabad, even as President Pezeshkian simultaneously expressed a clear preference for diplomacy. Foreign Minister Araghchi further reinforced this deliberate ambiguity by stating that dialogue could resume if and only if the United States fundamentally altered its behavior. Tehran has publicly articulated three uncompromising demands: the immediate lifting of the American naval blockade, the cessation of military operations against Iranian vessels during the ceasefire, and a guarantee of a threat-free negotiating environment. Washington cannot and will not satisfy all of these demands instantly. However, international diplomacy rarely requires absolute capitulation. It requires calculated gestures. Just as the United States temporarily delayed military exercises in 1994 to bring North Korea to the table, Washington might temporarily lower its maritime enforcement intensity or freeze select asset seizures. Tehran's geopolitical posture currently resembles a structural arch built under immense compression. It derives its outward strength entirely from the crushing forces pushing against it. But if the internal pressure is not vented, the entire edifice risks catastrophic collapse. Ultimately, in the brutal theater of statecraft, pride is a luxury purchased with time. And time is the one currency the blockaded nation has completely run out of. Furthermore, there is a highly technical detail buried in the recent diplomatic dispatches that fundamentally alters the complexion of this standoff. According to recent reports during the Islamabad negotiations, the United States explicitly demanded that Tehran's highly enriched uranium be physically removed from its territory and placed under external control. In stark contrast, the Iranian delegation only agreed to a process of supervised dilution. They proposed breaking down the highly enriched material into a lower purity that cannot be directly utilized for weaponry. To comprehend the immense strategic chasm between these two positions, one must understand the stark mathematics of nuclear enrichment. Natural uranium maintains a purity of roughly 0.7%, suitable for basic power generation but entirely useless for military applications. Low-enriched uranium, hovering between 3 and 5%, represents the ceiling permitted under the original JCPOA framework. Highly enriched uranium, which sits at 20% or above, is exactly what Tehran managed to stockpile prior to the outbreak of this conflict. While it falls short of the 90% purity required for true weapons-grade material. It dangerously compresses the breakout timeline to a nuclear device. Washington's calculus is deeply pragmatic. If the highly enriched stockpile is physically relocated beyond Iranian borders, rebuilding a weapons program would require a massive investment of time, granting the United States an undeniable security buffer. However, the domestic dilution proposed by Tehran leaves the actual material within their borders, monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Once diluted, the uranium cannot be immediately militarized, yet the physical possession remains undisturbed. Should Tehran ever decide to tear up the agreement, they could simply spin the centrifuges again, resurrecting their highly enriched reserves within a matter of months for their leadership. Exporting the uranium is synonymous with surrendering their absolute trump card. This is the precise epicenter of the current diplomatic deadlock. Yet, a sophisticated solution has emerged on the horizon. Moscow has quietly positioned itself as a potential custodian, offering to receive the highly enriched uranium. If accepted by both Washington and Tehran, this acts as the ultimate face-saving mechanism. For the United States, the physical threat is neutralized because the material leaves the adversarial jurisdiction. Reclaiming and re-enriching it from Russian hands would be a cumbersome, multi-step process, providing the global intelligence community with extensive early warning windows. Conversely, Tehran can credibly tell its populace that it did not capitulate to American coercion, but merely executed a calculated technical transfer to a trusted geopolitical partner. Utilizing a third party to resolve mutually unacceptable terms is one of the most frequently deployed methods for breaking international deadlocks. In the grand architecture of global diplomacy, a nuclear stockpile is much like a drawn bowstring. The United States demands the bow be broken entirely, while Tehran only offers to lower the aim. A third-party transfer is the elegant compromise where the arrow is simply handed to a bystander. Ultimately, when two proud nations cannot find the courage to step backward, they must find a proxy willing to stand between them. Consequently, 52 days into this grueling conflict, we must confront the ultimate question. How does this geopolitical standoff actually end? The trajectory is becoming clear, even if the timeline remains shrouded in diplomatic fog. This war will not conclude with a total, unconditional surrender by either major power. Instead, it will culminate in a carefully engineered framework where both capitals can credibly declare to their respective domestic audiences that they have not lost. Let us outline the specific blueprint of this inevitable compromise, which rests on three foundational pillars. First, there is the nuclear timeline. The final agreement will likely enforce a 10 to 13-year freeze on advanced nuclear activities. It will not be the sweeping 20-year suppression demanded by Washington, nor the brief 5-year window proposed by Tehran. The highly enriched uranium will be transferred out of the region to a friendly third party, such as Russia. Domestic enrichment will be strictly capped at civilian-grade low-purity levels, overseen by a verification regime significantly more intrusive than the original 2015 JCPOA framework. Second, we must examine the functional opening of the Strait of Hormuz through this narrow maritime corridor. Roughly 20% of the world's daily oil consumption must pass. A complete, unconditional relinquishment of administrative control is politically impossible for the Iranian leadership. Therefore, the resolution will rely on a coordinated, functional reopening. Commercial shipping will resume, but it will operate under a sophisticated international notification protocol. Traffic will flow not through direct transit tariffs paid to Tehran, but via an internationally mediated maritime coordination mechanism. This intricate arrangement allows the Iranian government to assert that it has preserved absolute sovereignty over its territorial waters. Simultaneously, Washington can broadcast to global markets that the fundamental geopolitical principle of freedom of navigation has been triumphantly secured. Third, the agreement requires a phased dissolution of the economic embargo. As the technical provisions of the nuclear freeze are sequentially verified, the financial blockade will be systematically dismantled. The initial phase will likely involve the unfreezing of targeted foreign assets, potentially releasing between $6 billion and $8 billion in currently trapped capital back into the Iranian domestic market. Only after this complex architectural framework is firmly established and verified will the United States Navy officially terminate its maritime interdiction operations. This is the precise anatomy of a sustainable resolution. Washington walks away having neutralized the immediate threat of a nuclear-armed adversary while restoring the arteries of global energy. Tehran walks away retaining its intrinsic right to civilian nuclear enrichment, securing desperately needed economic relief, and avoiding the humiliation of a forced capitulation. In the intricate machinery of international relations, a successful treaty is never a sword that severs an adversary's pride, but rather a meticulously calibrated scale, where both nations can believe they hold the heavier weight. Ultimately, true geopolitical stability is rarely forged in total victory. It is engineered in the quiet, pragmatic architecture of mutual survival. For investors and global markets, particularly within the manufacturing hubs of Asia, the immediate fallout of this diplomatic limbo requires a very specific psychological discipline. The conditional extension of the ceasefire has naturally introduced a brief sigh of relief into the energy sectors. We have observed West Texas Intermediate crude oil prices experience a slight retraction, drifting down from approximately $92 a barrel into the $88 to $90 range. However, any seasoned observer understands that this retraction is inherently temporary. The foundational anxieties of this conflict, the unresolved nuclear architecture and the restricted passage through the Strait of Hormuz, remain entirely intact for heavily export-dependent economies such as Taiwan. The current macroeconomic reading is unambiguous. Energy inputs will remain stubbornly elevated, but they are unlikely to spiral into immediate catastrophic new highs. The situation has entered a state of high-altitude consolidation, fundamentally distinct from a trajectory of explosive growth or rapid decline. In this precise environment, the broader Asian manufacturing supply chain, which dictates global pricing for everything from advanced semiconductors to heavy machinery, must absorb sustained operational costs. However, they are at least temporarily shielded from fresh, unpredictable geopolitical shocks. Yet, the most critical element to analyze here is not the fluctuating price of crude. It is the fragile psychology of the market. Over the past 52 days, global investors have been subjected to a relentless, punishing cycle of hopeful breakthroughs immediately followed by devastating setbacks. A significant portion of the capital base has been violently whipsawed, rapidly adjusting positions based on the latest diplomatic headline. Those who have frantically traded this volatility have overwhelmingly absorbed heavy transaction costs and profound psychological fatigue, drastically underperforming those who simply held their ground. When observing this high-stakes uncertainty, one is reminded of a core philosophical truth regarding capital allocation. The single most difficult investment decision is often the conscious choice to do absolutely nothing. A financial market trapped in geopolitical limbo is much like navigating a massive vessel through an ocean fog. The most dangerous action a captain can take is to violently alter the ship's course at every perceived shadow. Today, inaction is not a symptom of strategic paralysis. It is the ultimate expression of intellectual discipline. For the financial markets in Hong Kong, this exact logic of disciplined patience holds true, albeit with one crucial additional macroeconomic variable. The global community is closely monitoring the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs for any official diplomatic statements pushing for a rapid resumption of negotiations. Should Beijing formally insert its considerable geopolitical weight into the dialogue, it would serve as a powerful, short-term positive catalyst for Asian equities. Ultimately, a conditional ceasefire extension is undeniably better than a total collapse of dialogue. Yet, it remains vastly inferior to substantive diplomatic progress. Global capital is currently trapped in this twilight zone, destined to oscillate at high valuations until the diplomatic fog finally begins to clear. To conclude our analysis today, I want to draw your attention to a profound subtlety in the recent diplomatic rhetoric. The public statement from the American leadership noted that the military pause would be extended until the discussions conclude in some way. Those three words, in some way, are not merely standard diplomatic boilerplate. They represent a stark, honest admission of the prevailing uncertainty. Absolutely no one, neither the administration in Washington nor the supreme leadership in Tehran, knows the precise mechanical pathway that will finally terminate this standoff. This profound structural ambiguity is the fundamental root of the widespread anxiety currently gripping global energy and financial markets. However, recognizing that the conflict will definitively end in some way actually offers a powerful beacon of geopolitical clarity. It signifies a monumental shift in the strategic timeline. The global community has transitioned from a chaotic environment where the conclusion of the war was not even part of the strategic calculus to a definitive phase where the end is universally anticipated. In the dark theater of international conflict, anticipating an end without knowing the exact method is vastly superior to not anticipating an end at all. Over 52 days ago, when the initial salvos were fired, a spiral into total regional escalation seemed almost inevitable. Today, the world's most powerful capitals are openly acknowledging that a negotiated resolution is on the horizon. The macroeconomic direction is now crystal clear. It is only the chronological timeline and the specific diplomatic mechanisms that remain to be determined. These mechanisms are currently being forged in the slow, agonizing, and highly volatile crucible of international mediation. As this deliberately obscure process unfolds, the most dangerous action an observer can take is allowing the daily barrage of conflicting headlines to dictate a long-term macro perspective. The geopolitical tides are slowly turning. In the vast ocean of global statecraft, those who survive the storm are the ones who fix their gaze on the distant horizon, rather than panicking at the crashing waves around their feet. I will continue to relentlessly monitor these strategic shifts and decode the actual maneuvers hidden beneath the diplomatic noise. If you seek to stay ahead of the global curve and understand how these macro events will directly dictate your economic reality, ensure you subscribe and activate notifications. The endgame is no longer a theoretical concept. It is an approaching reality, and we will watch its architecture unfold together.